This presentation and the charts associated with it talk about stakeholder management and also about the budget cycles. We'll get into the budget stuff sort of at the end. What I want to do is spend a good deal of time up front here talking about stakeholders. Okay. Purpose of this whole thing is going to be identify your stakeholders, make sure we understand their expectations, and be able to basically effectively engage in those decisions throughout the budgeting life cycle. It's about keeping those people that are involved with the project involved with it and supportive of it. So who are stakeholders? That's anyone who has a vested interest in the project or is otherwise impacted by its success or its failure. So I can be the sponsor, the manager, project team, all of us, all the support staff, customers, users, all those kinds of things. But also it's opponents to the project, people that might want to be not believers in what we're doing and saying that money could be better spent elsewhere. Well, they're willing to point that out, and they want to, if we start to experience trouble, as they expect, then they want to be able to take that money and use it someplace else. So we have to keep all the stakeholders involved sort of as part of our plan. As a manager, you've got to make sure you're working with those people, communicating with them, and understanding how to manage those relationships going forward. So again, if anybody has a stake in the project, both positively and negatively, remember data analytics was about this project is about. It's about decisions. We can change the way work is being done, which can create opponents, right, to any kind of project. If we're doing something innovative and new with a new IT project or an analytics project, then you're inevitably going to be rattling some cages, right? You're going to be rocking the boat. So let's understand who these people are. Sponsor, that's the person most interested in seeing our project complete. When we started this, we said we need to find a non-IT sponsor that would run this thing. They're going to have a personal goal typically driving this project and overall responsibility for what we're doing. Stakeholders, then, is anybody interested in the outcome of the project. It can be users, developers, leaders, and it can include people who are opposed to the project as well. Our communications plan and involvement needs to communicate to all those different types of people. So for identifying these kinds of people, for internal projects, there's going to be the sponsor team, support staff, other managers, project managers. For external projects, if we're doing something that's going to be so they're customer focused, then you're looking at sponsor, team, support staff, internal customers, other project managers who are competing for resources, suppliers, competitors, government groups, regulatory groups possibly. All of those are going to be stakeholders in what you're trying to do. For our project, it's mostly internal, but I want you to keep in mind for external, that's what we're going to be looking at. And the people you need to keep up to speed. Sort of like when you're doing a construction project at home. You have the people that you're doing it for, you have the suppliers that are supplying you, you also have to work with the city on the codes and things like that. So there's a lot of stakeholders you need to keep in the loop. An analysis document is useful for doing just that. You put the names and organization, their roles, unique facts about them, level of influence, and suggestions for managing relationships. So stakeholder analysis is a useful register to have. Now, I bring this up because it's for you as a manager, it's very important. What you don't necessarily want to do is put this as part of the project management plan, because you might have some things in here that, people don't want to know that you're actually working the relationship with them. But, you want to make sure that you are communicating with folks with the kinds of and remembering the kinds of things that they're most interested in. It's useful to write this stuff down because otherwise you just forget, what exactly is this? In all the communications, you're trying to be deliberative about how you're communicating with folks. You need to understand what their role is and what they're important, what they care about. It's also useful to understand the power and interest grid here. So what you've got here is the level of power that people have within the organization, their ability to influence events, and then interest in your project. So from left to right, you've got their interest. And what you really want to pay attention to is up there in that top right corner. People who can influence the success or failure of your project, plus they're also interested in it. So a lot of people maybe can influence it, but, whatever, they don't care, just be successful. And there's a lot of people that might be highly interested, but all they can do is bark and make noise. Those people in top right are the ones you want to be aware of and really be very deliberative about how you're communicating with them. Now, engagement level, they can be unaware, they can be resistant, they can be neutral, they can be supporting, they can be leading, right? Actively engaged to make this successful. You want to get everyone from unaware, you want to get everyone from leading and into leading. So you make sure the high power, higher interest stakeholders who are unaware, resistant, or neutral are addressed. Okay, make sure that we're dealing with them. Again, just like risks, we try to get things down in the bottom left corner. What we're trying to do is get those people who are resistant to the project on the supporting category or the leading category. So what you do is basically just update your stakeholder register. As you understand everything about these people, you figure out whether they're leading, supportive, neutral, whatever, and put that in there as well. Stakeholder management then becomes another process that we're executing as a project manager. You have your current and desired engagement levels for each stakeholder. You manage the interrelationships between the stakeholders. You communicate requirements, and you have strategies basically for each one of those stakeholders. What you're going to do to try and engage with them and make them more supportive of the project, or at least keep them away from being negative towards the project or causing problems down the road. You should have a method for updating your stakeholder management plan on a regular basis, or updating your stakeholder register on a regular basis, so that you kind of know what relationships are out there. You have to understand and work those various stakeholders and devise a way to identify and resolve issues, especially issues that are going to be either associated with that particular stakeholder or issues that they might use as leverage against the project. Two important tools that you can use are expectations management matrix and your issues log. Remember what an issue is. When we talked about risks in week 3 rather, risks are realized, they become issues. Okay? When risks are realized, they become issues. They're typically something that impacts deliverables or task timelines, something that impacts cost, schedule, something that triggers another risk, or puts the entire project at risk potentially. So typically these need to be communicated to the stakeholder that's going to be mostly involved with them. Determine the correct amount of detail. Always report the actions that you're taking, right? Never go in there and just say we got a problem without actions that are associated with it and what you're doing to resolve it. Track them in an issues list. Okay, so now you've got some issues, we're tracking them, and we're going to work these things until they're fixed, and you're going to report how they're resolved. If you submit an issue without the actions that you're taking, then you're inviting stakeholders who might be disruptive, or even positive stakeholders, to come in and start telling you what to do, which can be detrimental to your project success. Okay, you need to be the one that's got the actions. You need to be the one that's out in front of this saying this is going to be resolved. Give your supporters a little bit of ammunition that they can take to those who are not supporting the project to say, hey, look, management's already got this taken care of. They're working it. So again, update your stakeholder register again. What's the strategy for each of these people now? Now that we know what the relationship is and what the issues are, what's the strategy we're dealing with them? So for this one, we've got, leverage good relationship with Tim to communicate plans. For Lauren, we've got she's very influential. Need to brief her and ask her and send a note to Karen. These are the kinds of things that, again, you don't necessarily want to have this floating around on the server someplace, because you're trying to be successful and you're writing down the things you need to go do. It's very important for your project, but it can be a little bit sensitive. Understand where that power comes from for each of these people. They're going to have power that comes from position. They're going to have power that comes from information, their knowledge. They happen to be the only people that know some stuff. There can be power that comes from resources that they have access to. If they're a functional organization, they have expertise. They're just very good performers, or they have personal traits. They're just very vocal kinds of people. Understand where they get the sources of power from that they're acting on, and be able to leverage that. Okay, and take advantage of that, and realize how do you, if they're not supportive, how do you neutralize that particular element of power? Okay. Then there's influence. How do people use their influence? A lot of people plain old threats and stuff, and leadership from positions of power and such. A lot of times there's an exchange or barter. People have something to trade. A lot of people with information or access to resources will use that as a method to influence. And a lot of times you can appeal to values, emotions, reason, especially in, with a lot of people in leadership positions. Those are effective ways to appeal. But you've got to communicate, and you've got to be deliberative. No matter what it is, you've got to be deliberate about how you're going to communicate and how you're going to appeal to those different sources of influence. The power paradox is this. Organizations work better when people have more power. Powerless people are less motivated. There's an old book called Absolute Power. It said absolute power, and there's an old saying that absolute power corrupts absolutely. And that's actually, it's the opposite of truth. The truth is the powerless tend to be more corrupt. That's the nature it's human nature. When we don't feel like we have control over the locus of control that we feel like we should have, however big or small that is, we tend to work outside those lines of norm. And that's reality. So if we understand that, if we, just like when we try to empower our own team members to basically be able to execute to the best that they think they can and think they should be, what you're doing is giving them power basically to be in control of that locus of control. That happens the same with all stakeholders, okay? We need to be able to help people understand that they have control over what they're doing. And if we can organize our project and organize communications and be able to explain why what we're doing is going to be important for folks to build their own ability to execute, whether they be other leaders or other stakeholders, then you're generally going to be a lot more successful along those lines. Because you got to do it credibly and you got to do it effectively. So always accept and seek to understand the politics around you. It's people's interests combined with their influence. That's all politics is. It's relationships. And there's nothing wrong with it. It's not inherently bad. It's how culture is built, and it's the structure upon which organizations rely on a day-to-day basis to execute the business goals, okay? So within that, we need to develop positive relationships, develop your exchange of influence with other people. What can we do with our project that might be helpful to other stakeholders? Listen carefully, be attuned to changes, and communicate more, but communicate well, deliberatively. And again, don't be afraid to share the power. Whatever we have in this project that we can do, make sure we bring other leaders into it so that we can be supportive of them and what they're trying to do. There's nothing, no reason for us to grab the glory. All we got to do is execute successfully and we'll win. Breaking logjams. If you get a logjam in a project, always resort to these guys. So go to your executive sponsorship, partnering with business units that will be supportive of this. Do some sort of service improvement. Tighten your user relationships. Look back at your project team selection. Is there someone we can bring on that would make this logjam go away because they would have the inside track? Okay. And again, communications. Look at what we're doing here. For logjams, what are we trying to do here? All these different examples are really about personal relationships. It's about doing something that isn't necessarily technically a project task, but it's about building a relationship that would help move us forward. So understanding the project frame in the organization, for every organization, there's a structural frame. So we talk about power in terms of the position. That's organization, RAA, all those kinds of things. Human resources frame means how are we people executing within that? That's more of your folks that have a position, resources with them. Political frame then is who knows each other, who's kind of relying on each other in different individual group interests, where those interests overlap. And there's culture, vision. What are we trying to accomplish as an organization? Those are the different frames in the organization that basically define how it's structured, and we need to be able to operate through those. The other thing to understand is when you're actually dealing with human resources, you're going to be dealing with people that have resource power and people who have overall position power. That's the difference between your functional organization, where they're dealing with who manages the resource, and project organization, who's running the projects. Your role as a project manager will depend, and you'll have some influence based on how the organization is structured between functional and project. Typically, they're matrix. So someone who manages a lot of software folks and makes sure the skills that most software folks have is up to speed, but then the projects themselves do a lot of the hiring. Whoever the people are assigned and report to in terms of their goals and objectives and their raises for the year, whoever they're accountable to for that has a lot of influence. So that's the kind of the thread that you need to work through depending on how that's set up. Organizational culture is a set of shared assumptions and values and behaviors that characterize the functioning of the organization. All of this stuff feeds into what we would say is the organizational culture. So being able to understand each of these ideas here, from group emphasis, member identity, risk tolerance that we talked about earlier in the course, reward criteria, tolerance for conflict, how open the organization is, all of those things are just elements of what has created the organizational culture, and being able to maneuver through that will be key to executing successfully. The other aspect of this is their attitudes toward IT. If they have a negative attitude toward IT, it's going to be difficult for this project to succeed. So we need to be doing the bullets listed here. Having a CIO at a high level that helps organize your projects. Having non-IT people is going to be critical to this. And then using all those functional strengths will be critical to your success. I say this because a lot of big companies, especially, IT has become sort of a necessary cost, a necessary evil, right? Instead of a critical element of success moving forward. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. We can go into big discussions about that later. But that might be a reality in your organization. You need your project. You can't necessarily fix that today, but your project needs to be able to be successful throughout that, however it works. So I'm going to stop the presentation here, because now I'll come on in a little bit more and talk about going into resources for next year.